Thank you all for joining us today. I hope everybody's having a good week. We are going to spend some time talking about how to build a business case for OT security. For those of you who joined our last webinar, if anyone was able to do that back in September, we spent our time talking about developing an overall strategy for OT cybersecurity. And in that, one of the questions that came out as we were having that discussion and as people followed up afterwards was, okay, if I have a strategy, how do I build a business case? Or maybe I don't have a strategy yet, but I need to have a business case to be able to push forward on initiatives within OT security to maybe even develop said strategy. And so what we thought we'd do today is to focus on a case study rather than trying to do a how-to of how do you build a business case. Instead, we're going to walk through a case study of an actual sanitized version of a business case. This is essentially, I will, as we get started with the actual webinar and I start walking through it, I will be presenting to you all almost as if you were the CEO or C-suite of the company, giving you the business case for cybersecurity, for OT cybersecurity. And hopefully that will form a good foundation for how you all might be doing this in your organizations. And then obviously we have a number of questions that came in beforehand. We welcome questions from you all because this is only relevant if it's specific to your particular situation. So happy to try and answer any questions that might make this more particular to the group of folks who are with us here today. So as I get started, just again, by way of introduction, I'm John Livingston. I'm the CEO of Verve. Prior to joining Verve about 5.5 years ago or so, I spent about 20 years of my career with McKinsey & Company, which is a management consulting firm, where I helped a lot of clients work through their digital transformation strategies, broader kind of change program strategies. And obviously one of the big things that we would do in that was to help our clients create a business case for whatever change program they were trying to pursue. After doing this for a number of years, particularly in the tech and industrial spaces, cybersecurity became a bigger and bigger issue, which is why I left McKinsey and joined Verve. Verve itself has been around for almost 30 years now. It was founded as an industrial controls engineering firm, so helping clients design control systems for power plants, water, wastewater, chemicals, manufacturing, steel, et cetera. And then about 15 years ago, when NIST CSF cybersecurity regulations were beginning to be put in place, Verve developed the first version of what we now call the Verve Security Center. And then over the last 15 years, we've continued to develop and evolve that platform such that it's now applicable across not just NIST CSF, but all sorts of other cybersecurity standards, as well as just generally focusing on OT security. We also provide a range of cybersecurity services to our clients, one of which is exactly what we'll talk about today, helping them put together a roadmap and a business case for investing behind the OT cybersecurity in their organization. And so, as I mentioned, this is essentially a version of a client example, sanitized significantly, but hopefully enough content here or substance here that gives you a sense of how you might build this for your organization. So with that, as I mentioned, this is today's discussion, an example of a business case for OT security. So in switching to my presenting mode too, is if this was the board of directors or someone in making the business case. The summary of what we're going to tell you today in this business case includes 4 things. First of all, operations technology in general, as an industry, as a category, is under growing threat and a set of new and emerging compliance requirements. Secondly, after our own technology-enabled assessment, so we have now assessed several of our plants within our own environment using a technology-enabled approach, we've identified significant cybersecurity risks in our environment that those threats that we'll talk about as an industry could leverage in terms of their ability to attack us and have impact on our operations. Number three, those risks, those vulnerabilities, when translated into actual operational impact, can have significant financial, operational, and safety impacts on our specific businesses. And so we have developed what we call our Think Global, Act Local approach to drive an efficient way of reducing those risks while ensuring plant operational uptime. However, that approach, even though it's an efficient approach, will require investment in leadership and financial resources. And that's what we're here essentially asking for today, is that commitment to leadership and resources. So without further ado, let's talk about each of these components as we go. So what's happening out there in the world of OT cybersecurity? Well, we are seeing a significant shift in the threat landscape that is around industrial processes and operational technologies. First, this is what we call an air raid, right? We are really having an air raid on our OT environments. First, from attackers. So not only are the attacks increasing, but what's happening is we're shifting from a time where it was primarily nation states, APTs, et cetera, that might be attacking OT, to now where this has become a commercial enterprise, where the for-profit hackers have discovered that industrial organizations are a very prime target because of the cost of downtime. And so the number of attacks is increasing as this becomes more of a commercial endeavor. Number two, IT. So IT is becoming a greater part of OT systems, creating greater risks as more commodity type devices are being brought into those environments. Number three, or the first R, regulation. We are starting to see, and this is accelerating just in the last several months, increasing regulations, both domestically here in the United States, but also around the world. One recent example are the regulations that the US TSA has now put around pipelines. One might refer to this standard almost as a NERC light, meaning a very prescriptive set of actions that one needs to take. These are then growing. TSA is expanding that to rail, to aerospace. We're seeing similar kind of regulations in the Middle East. Chile has adopted the full NERC CSF standards for its power sector. Brazil is following a similar, not exactly NERC CSF, but a similar model. So we are seeing this regulatory environment shift and becoming much more prescriptive. The second R, resource constraint. We are already resource constrained. We have, as you all know, we have reduced significantly the headcount in our plants from a process control point of view, trying to leverage various investments we've made there to reduce headcount. But that means that we're resource constrained at a time when the number of vulnerabilities is exploding in these ICS environments. Access is the second A. Remote access due to COVID-19, as well as the broader IoT, has increased the risks to these generally insecure by design sites. Next, our insurers. So in conversations with our risk management team, we know that insurers are starting to look to OT because they're realizing they may be insuring it and they don't even know it. And two, that if they are insuring it, they want to have clarity on what security applications are being deployed and what's our maturity level in the OT side. And then finally, obviously, the directors are asking about being able to see some measurable improvement. So all of these trends, maybe in this way, the trend is not our friend. These things are getting worse, not better. And so we as an organization need to figure out how we're going to respond to these industry changes that are occurring. To emphasize the point about our industrial organizations being under attack, manufacturing and energy are now the second and third most targeted industries, up from 8th and 9th in 2019. The number of vulnerabilities went up by about 50% in 2020, and it went up by about 100% in just the first 6 months of 2021. So we're seeing a rapid increase in the awareness publicly of the vulnerabilities that exist in our environments at a time when we're starting to be targeted more. Of those vulnerabilities, about 2/3 of those can cause operational disruptions, and 3/4 of them are higher critical on the overall CVSS scoring models. So in short, we are being targeted at a time when the known vulnerabilities are increasing. This isn't just us saying this, right? This is our peers talking. So this is a survey of ICS organizations about their views on the degree of risk and their views on what is the greatest threat vector. And what you see is just over the last couple of years, those describing the threat as severe has gone up by roughly 2x, and a significant drop in those thinking it's moderate or low. And when asked, okay, so if that's the severest, what is it that's driving that fear or that threat? The number one by far is ransomware or financially motivated threats. As you can see, that's gone up by roughly 2x since 2019, and is now the number one threat versus being fourth or fifth historically. And this is that point that this is no longer about APTs or about nation state targeting. Not that those aren't important, they are, but we're seeing this growth because attackers have now realized that ransomware is quite profitable within manufacturing. And the question is, okay, so why is it so profitable? It's profitable because of this, right? It's profitable because we know that these attacks can have significant plant days lost, meaning we can lose a significant amount of our revenue as a result of this. So 8 of the 9 attacks here caused physical shutdowns. And as you can see, these aren't just, a couple of hours here or there. These are significant plant days lost. And so as we get through the rest of our argument about the business case, you'll see that when we translate these numbers into dollars and cents, this can be significant. You obviously already can do the math in your head. If we lose on average 40 days of production, that is, 4, 6, 10, 40, depending on what we're making, $1 million of costs. This is sort of irrelevant in some ways of what the payout amount is to get your data back. It's in those plant days lost where the real impact happens. As I mentioned, one of the other R's is the rigorous regulation that's happening. And there's a couple of key points we want to make here is these regulations will require auditing, they'll require assessment, and they'll require OT systems management, meaning they are going to ask us, have we patched? Do we have clear vulnerability analysis? Have we managed the users and accounts on all of our systems? Are we monitoring for configuration changes? Have we updated our antivirus, et cetera? And that combination of auditing and having actions on all of our OT systems is a fundamental change in what's going to be required of how we manage the security in these environments. That means we're going to have a compliance strategy, and it means we're going to have board level involvement in terms of how we're going to respond to these regulatory requirements. That does mean extra labor. It means actioning on these assets that we frankly really haven't managed before, and it means we're going to have reporting on this. And so when we think about there's these attackers that are impacting us and the threats from the attackers at a time when our systems are becoming more insecure, at the same time that the regulators and insurers and others are asking for more in the way of proof, this is just a really big effort that we're going to have to undergo to be able to secure these systems. And we know that doing that is going to be different. So some have asked, well, great, we have a bunch of cybersecurity solutions for IT. What's so different? We'll just put them into OT. And the reality is that we all know that these are very different systems. 70% of the systems are non-traditional OS based, right? They're firmware based type devices with, down here, 450, 500, 600 different ICS protocols, most of which are insecure. We can't scan these devices like we would in IT to know their vulnerabilities. We have to take OT approaches to this. We can't just quickly, every time we see a threat, great, we'll patch it, or we'll shut down that system and reboot it, or whatever is the step. We don't want to reboot our turbines if we don't have to. We don't want to just patch something automatically because that could cause more harm than good. And so all of these threats, these challenges about attackers and needing more regulation, or regulations requiring more actions, has to be done within the context of OT as a unique set of assets. So that's the industry and what's going on. What about us? Are we secure? Are we insecure? Whatever. So we spent about 4 to 6 weeks and we did a tech-enabled assessment on several of our facilities to be able to see how we stack up, so to speak, from a security point of view. To do any kind of an assessment, we have to start someplace in terms of what framework we want to use. We've used a combination of the NIST cybersecurity framework and IEC 62443 as 2 standards. We've integrated those 2 to provide the right type of guidelines of what we're looking for. And we did that based on the SANS surveys of what others are looking at here. We believe by combining these 2 things, that helps us both get an overall view, NIST CSF, but also get very specific on some of the OT specific controls or standards that are out there. So in summary, against that NIST CSF, we are, and one can debate whether this would be a 1.5 if we were grading without rounding up, or a 2, but as you can see by the amount of red on this screen rather than green, we as an organization have a significant amount of risks. In this business case, I am not going to spend the time to walk through each and every one of these, but I will highlight a few. Limited visibility, right? So we don't know what's out there. We don't have an updated software inventory. As we went in and looked at the software that's on our systems, right? We've got TeamViewer on things. We've got LogMeIn. We have a number of software types of software out there that shouldn't be on control systems. And we didn't know that until we enabled this assessment. We're not doing vulnerability scanning. We have servers that are dual homed, which essentially make the any segmentation that we had in that firewall essentially pointless because we've now routed around it, et cetera. On the protection side then, great news is we put in some firewall protections between IT and OT, but many of our OT systems are actually not flowing through that firewall. We have routes around that, like I mentioned with the dual NICs. We have no application controls, et cetera. On the detection side, while we do have some detection happening at the perimeter level, there's no log management detection, et cetera, happening within the environment, meaning we don't really have visibility into changes, into alerts, et cetera. On the response side, then, we have some vendor support for certain things, but it's not clear in the contracts what that support is about and required to be. And obviously there's no coordination among those vendors. And there's really no OT people focused on this. And then finally on the backups, while we do have regular backups at the server level for some of the kind of IT OT servers, below that there's no backups occurring on a regular basis. And there's been no disaster recovery testing. Point is that this is our situation. The industry is under attack, under threat, and we sit here in a very insecure spot. So just some deeper dives on that. We looked at our patch levels, right? A very a typical way of assessing how secure we are. And from that assessment, we can see that we're missing 4,000 critical patches just across these few environments that we looked at. We can look at what patches, what are the types of patches, which specific assets are most at risk. And what we find, not surprisingly, because we're really not regularly patching these systems, there are certain OEMs where we've got them coming in at certain times to do patching, but clearly there's no rigorous patch process. And that then flows through to our vulnerabilities. So when we look at the number of vulnerabilities, we didn't scan the network. We used this tech-enabled assessment approach to gather this data back. And what we find once we do that is we've got literally thousands of higher critical vulnerabilities. And those vulnerabilities are, across a range of different assets, not just our, HMIs and servers, but also out into the PLCs and controllers that we have on the floor. And so we are sitting in a very risky position from a patch and vulnerability status. We then took one deeper dive into that to see, okay, well, yeah, but maybe these vulnerabilities aren't really critical or whatever. Well, it turns out that there are some really quote unquote big name risks out there, whether that be WannaCry or NotPetya, Bluekeep, the vulnerabilities that are relevant for those particular exploits. And we are still vulnerable to even those that everybody's talked about and thought we had resolved. And when we looked down, we then tried to see, okay, can we narrow that down even more on particularly those where are the greatest risk? And we have been able to do that so that when we build our roadmap, we can go after those that are at the greatest risk. We then looked at accounts. As you know, we don't manage these with Active Directory. And so what we find when we dive into that is we have lots of accounts with inactive users, passwords that are expired. We've got admin accounts on hosts. We have a number of account management risks that even if you didn't have any vulnerabilities, these are sort of sitting ducks waiting for someone to attack us. We then obviously also looked at the network risks. We won't go through all of these, but as you can see, we are the network protections that we might have thought were there really aren't. Our networks between IT and OT, while having a firewall in there, when you actually get into the rules of what's allowed in those firewalls by looking at configs, et cetera, you find that they're basically flat. We're reliant on OEM vendors for a lot of those sub networks, so to speak. We've got mismanaged device configs. We're not controlling network access for transient assets, variety of different network risks that are essentially adding to the endpoint risks that we've just been talking about. And so when we step back, right, the industry is under growing threat. And and this is obviously just a very short summary of what the tech-enabled assessment showed us, but we are in a state of significant immaturity when it comes to security. And in a world where the threats are growing, this is a major challenge and risk for us. But that's at a I guess a theoretical level, meaning, yeah, okay, so there are these vulnerabilities, there are these patches that are missing, users and accounts, whatever. What does it mean, right? So at the end of the day, we care about dollars and cents. And so just, again, as a graphical summary of what are some of those risks. So we laid out these various types of risks in our environment. And then what we did is we went through and said, okay, so what are the possible threats that we might be subject to? Ransomware, targeted external attacks, trying to compromise safety systems. And then we looked at those vulnerability vectors or those risks that we have, and what are they going to take advantage of? Well, they're going to take advantage of weak firewall rules or lack of patches or transient laptops that are moving across the network. And then we tied those to specific operational impacts. So what would that do to operations? It would lock up a server. We wouldn't have control or monitoring, so we'd probably have to shut down the plant because we didn't have safety monitoring. All the way down to, the operational impact could be, it disrupts the operation where it could give a physical disruption and possibly risk of life and limb. And so then we asked what can be done? So if we're ransomed, what could we do? Do we have backups that we could restore from? How long would it take us to do that? And then the timing gets down to, okay, given that possible threat and the ops impact, how long does it take us to recover? And how long are we out? So what we've done is try to tie these threats and risks back to operational impacts. And as you can see, it varies, but it can be, a day or a couple of days to weeks and months, depending on how well we're set up to protect and recover from these events. And so we've tied essentially those cyber risks to the physical side of what this means from our operations. And so in summary of that, we're not going to give you every one of those scenarios, but in summary of that, what we have is we have financial impact. The average cost of downtime on our plants is about $200,000 a day. 36 of those sites are networked together into a single flat network, meaning if ransomware gets into one of them, the chances it can spread are very, very high. And so therefore this 200,000 per plant per day multiplies very quickly. And what we're finding is that given we are insured for some of these risks, unclear, we'll come back to that, what exactly we're insured for, the insurers are now asking us to be able to demonstrate that we're addressing these kinds of risks. So these are real, and if we don't, our insurance rates will go up or we will not get insurance. So these are real dollar impact of these threats. We have operational impact. As you know, we have JIT or just-in-time delivery with a lot of our customers, meaning if we have downtime, they have downtime, and if they have downtime, we have penalties. More from a customer satisfaction point of view as well, but there are financial impacts to that. And then even within our own networks, we have supply chain risk, meaning one plant supplies another plant. So this plant doesn't look like it's all that big of a deal. Well, we know from our overall disaster recovery modeling that those supply chain impacts have impact down the road on another plant because we don't have enough inventory. And so we need to think about and address the security across the fleet, not just at the biggest sites. And then finally, safety and regulation. On the safety side, safety implications of a lack of control could have significant impact on about a dozen of our sites, meaning physical damage or potentially life and health damage. And then obviously our regulatory, whether it be OSHA or other regulatory requirements about damage to the environment, et cetera, might cause us to have significant fines or reputational damage. And so these technical risks that we've pointed out have very practical operational implications. And we have identified those and we've put dollars and cents to those, and we're happy to provide you more detail around those dollars and cents if helpful. Okay, so the industries are under threat. We are at risk. Those risks are impacting us potentially on a dollars and cents, life safety, et cetera. So what's our recommendation to go forward and the business case behind that go forward? And it's what we call think global, act local. So there are 5 parts of this roadmap and the business case. First is to define the sequence of initiatives. What you're going to see is this business model assumes we take certain elements and steps first and build foundational elements that can then be added to over time. This drives efficiency in that business case, but it also drives the fastest overall impact, even though it may seem like, well, all we're doing is foundation at the beginning, but it allows us to accelerate over time. Number 2, prioritizing the greatest risks and the investments valued based on the value of those OT assets, i.e. the production impact of those plants or operations. Number 3, we are aligning organization and resources. So what you'll see here in this business case is this isn't just technology, and it's frankly not just going to be the security team. We are going to have to align both our security resources and our very, very sparse OT resources to be able to enable the kind of protections we need in this environment. 4th, we are going to enable efficiency through technology. So we can't give you an efficient roadmap, an efficient business case if we don't leverage technology. But the key is, and we'll show you this, the technology has to all work together rather than being a series of one-off tools. And we'll talk to you about how that technology can enable this business case. And then finally, what we'll do is we'll show you how we're going to demonstrate ROI. We're going to be able to measure how we're doing against those standards, right? All this comes back to being able to have a metric that we want to achieve and measuring consistently, quarterly, annually, potentially even weekly and monthly against how we're doing against those standards, which allows us to demonstrate the ROI over time. So those are the five key parts of our business case, and we'll quickly walk through those. So as I said at the beginning, we have to start at the beginning. We have to start with a roadmap and a program. That program will take three basic steps. The first is it will start with the assessment phase, and the assessment that will then move into remediation, and then we'll move from there into maintain. So the assessment phase is about building a foundational layer of knowledge and information about our environment, which includes inventory, it includes protections, policies that are in place. It includes gathering some of the log data so we can see what's going on in the environment, and then establishing respond and recovery policies. In that assessment, that's kind of what we showed up initially for those first several sites we did. And we're going to take that concept and expand it across the rest of the fleet, so we can really get a detailed approach to what we're doing on the assessment phase. Secondly, we then move into a remediation phase. That remediation phase is where we'll go out and we'll take the first initial effort at cleaning up the problems that exist, the risks that exist. There's a bit of a bulge in this, right? We have to invest additional resources to make that happen. And that will increase our overall security. And then we move into the maintain phase. And in the maintain phase, what we'll be doing is to be monitoring those asset risks and network risks over time, maintaining our status, and then over time, adding on potential detection of potential additional threats and having incident response teams, et cetera. But this is our overall roadmap. And the idea is we can't just jump to remediate or maintain. We have to build up the foundation for each and every site of what is the current situation from a risk point of view, and how do we prioritize this. So the next, so when we do that, what are the sequence of things that we do that form that foundational layer? So as I mentioned before, we have a endpoint. We start with that foundational layer of endpoint and network visibility. We can't go chase things until we get that foundational layer built in. That includes an accurate inventory, both hardware as well as software. One of the things that we often find is people, great, well, I get my flows in my network, and I kind of know there's devices out there. But one of the big risks we see is knowing that you have TeamViewer that's never been used, but it's on there. Or there's, as crazy as it sounds, like having Zoom or having LogMeIn, et cetera, on these devices. Understanding connectivity flows, physical port connect, users and accounts. You saw that in the assessment pages, where our users and accounts, we have a lot of these dormant and accounts that aren't well configured, et cetera. So getting that visibility allows us to build the remediation plan for each of those sites. One of the things that we know we tried to do was a network segmentation. And in that network segmentation, we struggled with that. We struggled with it because we didn't have any visibility into what we were trying to segment. So by getting this foundation, it accelerates our ability to do things like network segmentation. It allows us to find where our prior network protections may have drifted. So we're pulling in all the configurations of those network devices to see where the rules have drifted, et cetera. So anyway, that foundational layer is the first part of our business plan. Then, as I mentioned, we've prioritized our investments then based on those foundational layers on the value of the different plants that we had. So we've broken down our plants into bronze, silver, and gold, broadly based on the output, the value of the output from each plant. Obviously, there's some customization of that because we've got some plants that are gold, even though they're small, because they contribute a significantly important component to other plants. And if that one part of our supply chain goes down, it impacts other sites down the road. Anyway, we've broken these down into bronze, silver, and gold. On the bronze side, we're applying a certain set of controls, a minimal set, less investment, et cetera. And this is against the CSC 20 as our standards of what controls will be, or CIS 20, what controls will be implementing. Things like, as you see on the bottom, endpoint management, basic endpoint hardening, network monitoring. At the silver sites, those that are a little bit more valuable, and obviously we have lists of those sites, we're going to do those bronze controls, and then we're going to add a few things to them. We're going to do perimeter segmentation. We're then going to also add in endpoint protection and monitoring, both whitelisting as well as malware and EDR type capabilities. And then finally, on the gold sites, we'll be adding even further risk reduction and remediation efforts. And so the concept here is that each one of these groups of sites will be receiving a different level of investment based on the value at risk, essentially, of each of those types of facilities. I mentioned that the next part of our business model, business case, is to take this think global, act local approach. So one of the problems we have in OT is it's not IT, meaning we can't centralize all the management of these systems. We've got PLCs, we've got controllers, we've got HMIs that are running processes that have to run 24/7. We cannot run these and manage them as if they were IT devices. IT has the advantage of being able to centrally manage things and patch at will, et cetera. OT, we can't do that. And so what we've designed is an approach that is what we're calling think globally and act locally. So this business case or business model will take information from all of our sites, all 50 of them around the world, and we'll bring that up to the top. So we will have one database that has all of our asset information, all of our risk information, et cetera. And so a small team of people can monitor and manage the risk and observe it and analyze it, et cetera. And they can then create playbooks for what we want to do about those risks. So for instance, we have a series of vulnerabilities that are present. We know we need to patch those. Well, that team can take those patches and start to prioritize them, and we can build playbooks that can be then distributed out to the local sites. Those playbooks are automated so that when we distribute them, this won't require a bunch of manual effort from the site, but it will be automated and distributed, ready to go in a package. We'll then have regional subject matter experts who can support those plant IT resources. But then when we're going to actually execute an action, we're going to patch something, we're going to harden a configuration, we're going to remove a user, those folks at the plants who know their process best, or in some of our environments where we have shared control centers across multiple plants, we will have those people who know the process best execute on those commands. So they'll be automated, they'll be ready to go. All they'll have to do is essentially hit go, but they will be in control of those. And this is how we're going to balance the OT need for sensitivity to the process with our security need of being able to manage those assets. And so the business case is designed to centralize this, and we believe we can get about a 70% cost savings in the overall approach by centralizing this. The current alternative to that is that we'd essentially have to have security personnel at each site. They'd be managing essentially a security system, oftentimes maybe from one of our vendors, where they're trying to manage that locally, or we're paying the vendor to manage it locally. It's a much more efficient way to bring that all to the top and then distribute the actions locally. So what are those activities at those different levels? So we've spent time and we have detailed spreadsheets on all this that we can provide to the management team over time. But basically, we've broken out the various activities that each of these levels is going to have to take. And again, I won't go through all of these details here, but understand that we've done this work to know that plant IT is going to be having time to execute actions, to doing software admin, et cetera. The engineering teams at the sites will have to provide input into that, whether that be, we need to adjust network communications and rules in our firewalls, or we want to deploy these patches. Okay, we need to test those and make sure that they're appropriate and they don't disrupt operations. At the regional level, there's a lot of training that group will do, but they'll also be working hand in glove with the people at the site to be able to help them execute on any of those central team recommendations. And then finally, that smaller team centrally can then analyze endpoint network data to identify vulnerabilities. They'll build those playbooks I mentioned. They'll build that automation scripts that can then be distributed. And then obviously any incident response activities that team would lead. But this split of organization allows us to drive efficiency, as I mentioned, 70% more efficient in the actual maintenance of things and the remediation of things, but also ensuring plant uptime and sensitivity to the OT environment. So what does that mean in terms of hours, dollars, et cetera? So our organization model at a 50 plant model is roughly as it's laid out here. So at the plant level, what we've done is we've broken this into the maintain and the remediate and the maintain components. And we have we've broken down the number of hours in each one of those. So the remediate is that part where we're going to improve on the base level of security, and then over time we're going to maintain that as time goes on. And so what you see is that the different types of plants, we've allocated a certain number of hours of what we think that will take, both in the remediation phase as well as the maintain phase. And then similarly on the regions and at the central site, we've built FTE numbers of each of those activities for each of those sites. So that is at a high level of the types of resources that we think we're going to need and the type of budgeting that we're going to need in terms of headcount to do this. And again, we have more detailed spreadsheets that can go behind them as well. So how are we going to do that? We mentioned we're going to leverage technology. So we're going to take a platform and we're going to use that platform to gather asset inventory, which will become that foundational layer, as we mentioned. And that asset inventory then links together all of the key pieces of our security applications. So this platform allows us to do vulnerability management, patch management, configuration management, user management, anti-malware, maintaining our whitelisting, et cetera. It brings in all of our telemetry data to allow us to do intrusion detection. And if we've got, in certain sites, we've got perimeter, IDS, et cetera, we can bring that in. And then also ties into all of our backup tools so that we can monitor for backups and conduct incident response. The reason for this is in IT, we've had silos, right? So we've had various different functions. In OT, we need to bring this platform together if we're going to be able to do this in an efficient way. And so we will be leveraging technology to do this. There is an investment in that technology, but the concept here is invest to save the cost of having, multiple people at every site trying to manage security on their own. And that platform will allow us to build that 360-degree view in the assessment phase that we talked about. So be able to see all of these different risks, but then in the remediation phase, allow us to actually take those actions. So we are not going to have a gap between assess and remediate. The minute we've assessed the situation, we can immediately go and start to remediate those risks that we see, which will accelerate our time to security or to remediation. We've spent a lot of time analyzing different approaches to how we can go about the technology. So we've looked at using multiple tools, kind of standalone independent tools, one for vulnerability, one for network, one for backups, et cetera. And then we've analyzed an approach where we bring all of that together with the same deployment, the same platform, et cetera. And this model saves us about 30% of our total cost, both from a labor as well as licensing point of view in that platform. And so not only are we going to do think global, act local, which is going to save us about 70% of our labor, but the way we're approaching our technology with this integrated platform will save us about 30% of the cost of the technology and the deployment of that technology. And then finally, as I mentioned, if we're going to have an ROI, we got to be able to demonstrate that ROI and maintain it over time and manage it. And so what we'll be doing is creating an initial score against our NIST CSF framework here. And then we'll be monitoring how we're doing on a quarterly, annually kind of basis. And we will watch and see to prove that we're actually demonstrating the ROI we intended to, meaning that we are delivering the results on a metrics basis that we expected to. And so all in all, we know this industry is under threat. All of our industrial operations are under threat. We have big risks, right? No question. There are dollars and cents and operational impact risks. And so we believe we've put together a business case that is the most efficient way of delivering a risk reduction in that environment with a way of maintaining the OT sensitivity that we need to do by building this think global, act local approach. So with that, that brings me to the end of our basic business case presentation. I hope that was a helpful description of one example, right? Obviously sanitized, et cetera. But I know there's a number of questions, so I thought we'd pivot into that to address those questions and see if we can make this even more customized to folks who would like it. So there's administrative questions around will the presentation deck be available? Absolutely, we'll be sending out both the PDF of the slides as well as a recording of the presentation. There's a question around, in this scenario, are you drawing on the likes of MITRE ATT&CK to validate assumptions about threats and likelihood? We do absolutely leverage components of MITRE ATT&CK to do that. It is one of the frameworks that we use. MITRE ATT&CK is great to model out an event that has happened and what stage of the attack trajectory or kill chain has been used in that particular part of the event or the alert that you're seeing. And so we definitely use that to say, oh, okay, you have potential event going on here or there. But even more than that, we're also just looking at the fundamental risk profile of the assets. And then we're running our own set of scenarios around what that could mean, what could happen if that vulnerability were impacted or exploited in that environment. So we are using MITRE ATT&CK, but it's only one of the frameworks that are used in this particular approach. We have a question about what's the significance application of the system to Delta V. So Delta V, like Honeywell, like GE, like Siemens, et cetera, is one control system. What we're talking about here is both a platform and an approach that's vendor agnostic, meaning we do not believe that you can efficiently deliver security if what you're going to end up with is 6 different security solutions, one from each of your key OEM vendors. Number one, there's going to be a bunch of your vendors who aren't included in that. But number two is you're going to end up with this hodgepodge of stuff across your infrastructure. It doesn't tie together. There's no centralized management. It's as if you said, okay, all of my HP computers are going to be managed with one security system, my Dell by a different one, and Mac by a third. Right? We couldn't run our business that way. And so we don't think you should run it that way in OT either. This is an approach that is a vendor agnostic approach, frankly, to drive the efficiency that we think you need. Is there a risk? Is there any use of risk quantification, such as FAIR, to estimate the loss? Mike, absolutely could be. In this particular business case, there was not, but you could absolutely use those kinds of frameworks. It's a great framework. There's another one that is the cyber PHA, which is another approach, physical hazard analysis, which is more about physical hazards. Some of these aren't really physical hazards. But yes, there's no reason to say you couldn't use FAIR. The only thing I would say there is it depends on the investment you have time or resources to make before you build your strategy. Let me expand on that. So a lot of times what we see is there hasn't been any resources allocated to this yet. And there's a group of people who are trying to build a business case. Well, to go through a full FAIR or PHA is not an easy task. It requires lots of resources, lots of commitment from lots of people around the organization. So what we've found typically to go about this is we'll do a first version where we use kind of best practices and that sort of thing that gets the buy-in to make that investment. And then it may make sense to refine with something like FAIR down the road. But usually we're trying to do this in a relatively lower cost way up front to be able to get a business case, right? To be able to make a more real complete view of all the various risk trade-offs that one might make in the environment. We had other questions. One was about OT insurance, OT cybersecurity insurance that came in before the webinar. How do we determine the scope of that, of coverage? So I think this is a real part of any business case and business strategy needs to be the cybersecurity insurance. What we're finding is that in many cases, the OT coverage is not what people expected to be in their policies. And so this is obviously something you need to sit down with your risk management and your insurance folks with. But what we find is that in many cases, it's not being, I'm not sure what you want to call it. Basically, we're not getting the coverage that we thought we were going to get. And so we would highly argue that you should go review those policies, make sure with your broker that you have insurance coverage, and then understand what is it that is required of us to demonstrate that we're doing to maintain that coverage over time. And then another one was, if there's nobody, if we don't have an OT organization, who's actually responsible or accountable for this effort? And I think in many organizations, when we start, there is no real OT group, meaning there are plant process control teams, and then there's IT. And there's not really anyone in the middle there. Our experience has been the best way to do this, whether you're one of those plant teams or whether you're somebody in IT, is to get a group together of people from both those plant teams as well as IT and have a steering committee, whatever you call it, to come together across IT and OT to solve this problem. Now, it's likely that as you go forward, as you saw from our business case, that you're going to need an OT security group somewhere, whether that's under engineering or OT or under IT, one can debate, and there's lots of debates there. Our experience would say that it's got to be a blend. In other words, we're probably not going to put OT security people in every plant. So we have to leverage those process controls or whatever your organization calls them, the teams that are at those sites, to take on these new tasks around OT systems management, and then to centralize those things into IT security that are more about the detection, the playbooking, et cetera. So I think that there's some other questions that we got beforehand, but hopefully that gives you enough gist of what we're doing today. And as I mentioned, we will be providing the video and the slides as well. So I'll bring it to a close, give everybody a couple minutes back to get to your next meeting. I hope this was helpful for everyone. As I mentioned, I guess maybe I didn't mention, we'll be doing another webinar at the end of November. And so everybody will be, get an update on that right after the American Thanksgiving. So sometime in that last week of November. We look forward to welcoming you all there. Again, thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you soon.